Who am I? My name's Rob Gregory. I'm a partner at Maddocks Lawyers, but I'm also a lawyer and a geek, and I think it's important to understand when you're looking at an observation as to what the position of the observer is. So that's a IoT device that I built to drive my garage. The only thing that's actually required is the button on the top right, because it turns green when the garage is closed, orange when it's half open, and red when it's wide open. That's all my wife wanted. Everything else is just the geeky stuff for me. It's about the temperature in the garage, the Wi-Fi signal strength, everything else. I also build and fly drones. I like making drones, I like working out how they work mechanically, and I like programming them, and I break them a lot. So from those two things, I think in any technology project or idea, or really any human endeavour, you need to build, break things, learn from that and rebuild. But you need to do it in a safe way. So that break was a bit over 200 kilometres an hour when that thing hit the ground. Fortunately, there were no dog walkers around the park very early that morning when I was trying that thing out. I'm also a lawyer. So I'm a co-author of ECA's National Energy Regulation Handbook, which if you haven't had a chance to have a look at that, is available from ECA's website under the tools section on the website. And the aim of that is to use about 270 pages to summarise something over 3,000 pages of legislation. Open to criticism that we haven't done a great job of it, or we've chosen the wrong parts to summarise. The other thing that's relevant about that is that we did that that's current as to October 2016, and a lot of water has flown under the bridge since then. Half jokingly, I say I'm waiting for complete regulatory certainty before we do our next edition, but maybe that's not such a great idea. But I'm also a human being, and I have a house, and that house has electricity. We live in Victoria, and we have advanced metering infrastructure, and I have on my phone my distributor's energy dashboard, which has lots of graphs and colours, and I honestly don't know what I do with any of that information. So despite being a geek and an energy regulatory lawyer, and for what it's worth, my wife is a business person who used to sell energy to consumers, we really don't understand any of this, and we don't take actionable insights from it. So that's a bit about me. The other thing I did today was to listen very carefully to what Rosemary, my client, was saying about doing our homework and looking at the little green book that's on everyone's desks. And the idea here is really that my space is the regulatory. What are the barriers? What are the new rules? What is the policy research that needs to be looked at? And there's sort of the lens I've been looking at, what I've been hearing and learning over the last 2 days. A big chunk of my practice involves sort of skills like using intellectual property law, competition law, privacy, corporate governance, and a lot of my clients are both regulators but also participants in regulated industries. As Rosemary mentioned, I really cut my teeth in internet governance and regulation for a long time before, basically through Rosemary, I started to come into the energy space, and for the last 3 or 4 years I've been kind of learning energy. I don't know that I feel like I know an awful lot more about energy than I did 3 or 4 years ago. It is incredibly dense, and we're certainly discussing that with KPMG last night. That's their perception also. Going back, really the overall sum up I would have coming out of these 2 days, but also the CDR particularly, is that there really clearly is, I think, potential for great benefit. There is also a number of really serious risks. The risks that I've taken away are around privacy and cybersecurity, which are related but different things, and people occasionally lose sight of that. There's the risk of bad actors coming into the sector, particularly using the data that becomes available to provide inappropriate advice or just straight rip people off. There's real issues around accessibility. How do we make this mountain of currently siloed but increasingly not data available in a way that's accessible to people that they find useful? But I think and for providers, the providers of the data, the creators of the data, the retail businesses and the distributions, there's real issues for them around intellectual property, investment certainty, and return on investment for building the systems that are necessary to make this work. So to my mind, the regulatory framework must both recognise all of these risks including the risks of the unknown unknowns. And a shout out to Craig Membry, because I thought I was going to be the first person to say that today. I'm glad someone got there before me. And taking that regulatory lens to it, what are we looking at? How do we break down barriers, and how do we be careful not to create new ones? What rules are going to be required, and what policy and research are needed in that framework? So what I'm going to also particularly look at from the energy consumer's perspective is, where does the consumer work, and how does consumer centricity fit into all of this? So at two levels. Firstly, it is a legal obligation, and it has been for a long time. The objective of the law is to promote efficient investment in and efficient operation of the use of electricity services for the long-term interests of consumers. That's the sort of the fundamental grundnorm, if you like, of the entire energy law, and it's the same for the gas objective. It's also clearly widely accepted by industry, and we saw yesterday the Energy Charter discussion that the very first principle is around putting the customer at the centre. So I think we've sort of crossed both of those barriers now. So customer centricity is not just a nice to have or a marketing slogan, but a legal obligation, but also more importantly an organisational imperative to create sustainably profitable businesses in this space. The challenge is how to create governance frameworks, drafting principles, and then the actual rules, guidelines and enforcement priorities which put customers at the centre of it all. We need to keep in mind the key findings, for example, of the Financial Services Royal Commission, the Hayne Royal Commission, which could be considered as an incredibly expensive root cause analysis as to how an entire sector lost its focus on what is in the best interests of consumers. Let's not be there in 20 years' time. So what specific things I've learned over the last 2 days? I'm going to quickly sum up on the things I've heard, and then my sort of initial observations and tentative conclusions from that. I have heard not $1 more, not 1 day early, several times. And picking up on Steve Bloom's comment about the vomit principle yesterday, I think Rosemary's going to need to say that an awful lot more. I've heard that most customers are concerned about price, cost and reliability, but they're not prepared or not capable, or a bit of both, of being deeply engaged in this. Nobody is resource man, even me. I'd like to be, but I'm not. Thank you to Yolande for that. But I think most residential and small to medium enterprise customers really can't spend the time that many others of us think we should. And quite frankly, I think that's probably true of larger energy users too. I like the idea that I heard from Brian, I think from CSIRO. Really what people want is hot showers and cold beer. Provision of useful information to consumers in a comprehensible form in a timely way can really help them change their behaviour. I think we've learned that from multiple presentations over the last 2 days. And there'll be many channels to provide that information to consumers, picking up on the jam analogy. What we need to do, what we realise is we don't probably need 20 types of jam, but perhaps 3 or 4. And it's not clear what those flavours will taste like. So my experience with internet standards and internet regulation over 20 years is that the main use cases probably don't exist. I started in internet regulation in 1999. Facebook was created in 2004. So we need to have a system that's flexible enough to deal with that. We don't know what kind of jam people are going to want. So my observations and tentative conclusions, the things I think I've learned, is that we'll need a regulatory framework rules, guidelines that helps providers and consumers to choose the right flavours of jam to offer. What do people really want and what do they really need? We'll need regular formalised feedback loops to enable those rules, guidelines, but including the high-level frameworks, particularly in CDR across the entire economy, but with a real focus on the energy sector, to keep going through what's sometimes called the Boyd cycle or the OODA loop, observing what's happening, orienting, deciding to make a change, acting on that change, observing again. This will not be set and forget. And picking up on what Mark Henley said in one of the sessions this morning, this can't be about consumers. It can't. I think the saying was not about us without us. So the process can only be about consumers and their long-term interests, as interpreted by the industry and government. Consumers need a formalised role in the institutional architecture for the energy sector. So I think ECA and fora like this are fantastic for that, and I've really enjoyed hearing the discussion, some of the disagreements, and I'm looking forward to seeing the ACCC's paper coming out shortly, and the way forward from here. Thanks very much.